Okay, picture this. Imagine being charged with a murder where the forensic evidence and all the eyewitness testimonies agree on one undeniable fact. You absolutely did not fire the fatal shot. No way. So how on earth does a legal system justify holding you responsible? Well, today we're exploring a profoundly tragic event, the 1998 Ocean View shootout in South Africa, which resulted in the heartbreaking death of a 7-year-old girl named Crystal Abrahams. But beyond the tragedy itself, this case, widely known as S.V. Thebus, morphed into this completely fascinating legal anomaly that made its way all the way to the Constitutional Court. In this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly how a single chaotic afternoon birthed two of the most complex constitutional puzzles in modern criminal law.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the vigilante shootout. Then, what is common purpose? Followed by the constitutional challenge, the right to silence, the alibi trap, and we'll wrap it all up with the final verdict.
All right, part 1, the vigilante shootouts. To really understand this legal puzzle, we have to start with the facts on the ground. We're looking at a scenario where a community group organized a vigilante protest against reputed drug dealers in their area. Now, we're just looking strictly at the factual chain of events here, unpacking how a protest spiraled into an absolute tragedy. It was November 14, 1998. Around 1 p.m., a group of protesting residents gathered in Ocean View. By 2 p.m., they formed a motorcade, about 5 or 6 vehicles, and started approaching the houses of reputed drug dealers, including a guy named Grant Cronje. Then, around 3 p.m., as the motorcade approached an intersection, Cronje just opened fire on the group. Members of the vigilante group jumped out of their cars and immediately returned fire. It was in this totally chaotic, Wild West-style crossfire that young Crystal Abrahams was fatally shot and 2 others were wounded. Fast forward a few months, and the police make their arrests.
Now, out of that massive, chaotic crossfire, exactly 2 men, Abdraghman Thebus and Muhammad Adams, were ultimately arrested and stood trial. But here is the crucial twist, the thing that sets up everything we're about to discuss. Forensic and witness evidence definitively showed that neither Thebus nor Adams fired the bullets that actually hit those victims. Yet, they were charged with murder and attempted murder.
Which brings us to part 2. What is common purpose?
So you're probably wondering, how can someone be charged with murder if they didn't pull the trigger? It all comes down to the doctrine of common purpose. It's a common law rule. Basically, if 2 or more people actively associate in a joint unlawful enterprise, the conduct of one person is imputed or legally transferred to the others. Think of it like a giant puzzle. Actually, scratch that. A bank robbery is a better example. If you agreed to rob a bank and your role is just to stand outside as the lookout, you are still a bank robber. If your partner inside shoots a security guard, you can be held legally responsible for that murder, even though you were just outside and didn't touch a weapon. The law basically says your active association in the crime means you share the blame for the consequences.
But you can't just be a passive bystander. South African law, relying on a really important precedent known as Ngedzi, lays out some super strict requirements. You must be present at the scene. You must be aware of the assault. You must intend to make common cause with the group. You have to perform a physical act of association. And finally, you must have the required mental intent, what lawyers call mens rea, meaning you foresaw the possibility of someone being killed and just acted recklessly anyway. In this specific case, witnesses saw Thebus holding a pick handle and Adams collecting spent bullet cartridges from the street. The court ruled these actions checked every single one of those boxes. They were actively associating with a violent mob.
Let's move on to part 3, the constitutional challenge. Now, the Thebus and Adams didn't just accept this common law doctrine lying down. They brought forward a major defense, arguing that this whole concept of collective guilt actually violates their fundamental individual rights under the brand new South African Constitution. It's a massive tug-of-war. On one side, you have individual rights. The appellants argued that common purpose de-individualizes guilt. It arbitrarily strips them of freedom without proving a direct physical causal link between their specific actions and the child's death. That, they argued, completely violates the presumption of innocence. But on the flip side, you have society's need. The court noted that widespread violent crime by mobs and gangs is deeply, deeply destructive. If the law requires proving exactly which bullet from which gun killed a victim in a massive shootout, well, prosecuting collective violence becomes literally impossible. So it's this incredibly delicate balancing act between protecting the individual and protecting society.
But hey, what if you say, hold up, I wasn't even there? What if you say you weren't holding a pick handle because you were miles away? This question completely shifts our explanator from the common purpose debate over to our second big legal mystery. We're zooming in solely on the first appellant, Mr. Thebus, and his very specific defense strategy.
Which leads perfectly into part 4, the right to silence.
we are now going to explore the super tricky rules of pretrial alibis and the immense weight of your constitutional right to just remain silent when you're arrested. Section 35(1)(a) of the Constitution spells it out. Everyone who is arrested for allegedly committing an offense has the right to remain silent. When Sergeant McDonald arrested Thebus, he read him this exact right. He warned Thebus, hey, you're not obliged to make a statement, and if you do, it can be used against you. Thebus took that warning straight to heart. He deliberately chose not to make a formal written statement. He kept his cards very close to his chest.
Okay, part 5, the alibi trap.
Here's where it gets super sticky. We're diving into the psychological and legal catch-22 that Thebus found himself in when his case finally hit the courts nearly 2 years later. When he was first arrested, Thebus gave this really vague, truncated oral remark to the cops, just saying the family was in Hanover Park, but he totally refused to say where he specifically was. Fast forward 2 whole years to the high court trial. Suddenly, Thebus drops a highly specific alibi. He claims he took a train to Weinberg, led afternoon prayers at a mosque, and then spent the entire time with his second wife in Parkwood Estate. He even brought in witnesses to back the whole thing up.
Which brings us to this huge, glaring question. Does using your right to silence mean your later alibi is just a made-up lie? The Supreme Court of Appeal looked at Thebus's sudden, highly detailed alibi 2 years after the fact and just assumed it was fabricated specifically because he didn't tell the police right away. Their logic was, hey, an innocent person would immediately clear their name. But wait a second. Didn't the police literally just tell him he had a constitutional right to remain silent? Thebus argued he was basically being punished for simply exercising the exact rights the police read to him in the first place.
And the Constitutional Court justices? They reacted really strongly to this trap. Justices Goldstone and Oregon delivered a very powerful view on it. They basically said that warning someone they have a right to remain silent, and then later using that exact silence to infer they're guilty, is deeply fundamentally unfair. To quote them directly, an uninformed choice is indeed no choice. Think about it. If the police don't warn you that staying quiet could destroy your alibi later on, then your choice to stay silent isn't truly informed, is it? It essentially turns the Miranda-style warning into a literal trap.
And finally, part 6, the final verdict. So, we have these 2 massive constitutional mysteries, common purpose and the right to silence. How did the highest court in the land untangle all of this to deliver a final ruling? Well, the Constitutional Court's incredibly nuanced split ruling resolved it in 3 distinct steps. Step 1, they ruled that common purpose is, in fact, constitutional. The need to fight collaborative mob violence is a pressing social need, and as long as the state proves you had intent and actively associated with the mob, it totally stands up to the presumption of innocence. Step 2, they actually agreed with Thebus that his right to silence was technically infringed. The lower courts absolutely should not have drawn a direct inference of guilt just because he stayed quiet about his alibi before the trial. But here is the absolute kicker. Step 3, the convictions stand. Even though his right to silence was infringed, the court looked at the totality of the whole shebang. An independent eyewitness named Keel, a guy who had actually known Thebus since childhood, firmly and reliably placed Thebus right there at the scene, holding a weapon. The evidence was so overwhelming that the flawed logic regarding his silence just didn't change the ultimate factual truth of his guilt.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to chew on. The Svi Thebanis case perfectly encapsulates the incredible tightrope our legal systems walk every single day. On one side, you have the absolute necessity to hold mobs accountable for tragic, chaotic crossfires. On the other, the sacred rights of the individual facing the overwhelming power of the state. It really forces us to ask, when does the safety of the public outweigh the silence of the individual? Think about where you draw that line. Thanks so much for joining us as we unpack this fascinating case in today's explainer. We'll catch you in the next one.